Welcome to the darker side of Prohibition-era America, where loyalty was currency, fear was law, and punishment was unforgettable. In the roaring 1920s, as jazz blared and speakeasies thrived, Al Capone built an empire from bootlegging, bribery, and blood. But what truly kept his organization in line wasn't just money, it was discipline, enforced the mafia way. Betrayal didn't earn a warning, it earned a lesson. From public beatings meant to send a message, to disappearances that whispered louder than gunshots, Capone's punishments were calculated acts of power. One infamous story tells of a traitor beaten to death with a baseball bat during a friendly dinner, an execution designed as theater. These weren't random acts of violence, they were tools of control in a criminal kingdom. In this video, we'll uncover how fear shaped Capone's rule and why his methods still haunt organized crime history today. On a frigid January morning in 1920, the United States embarked on what many believed would be a grand moral experiment. The 18th Amendment had just taken effect, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the nation. Politicians and temperance advocates celebrated in the streets, convinced they had struck a decisive blow against vice and corruption. They could not have been more wrong. Within hours of Prohibition's implementation, a young Brooklyn-born tough named Alphonse Gabriel Capone was already calculating how this noble experiment would transform him from a small-time street enforcer into the most powerful criminal in American ponds. History. As Capone himself would later quip with characteristic brazenness, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." What the people wanted, it turned out, was alcohol, and Capone would give it to them in quantities that would make him richer than most captains of legitimate industry. Capone's journey into the underworld began not in the glamorous speakeasies of Chicago, but in the grimy streets of Brooklyn's immigrant neighborhoods. Born on the 17th of January 1899, to Italian immigrants Gabriele and Teresa Capone, young Al grew up in a world where survival often meant bending the law. His father worked as a barber, struggling to support 9 children in a cramped apartment near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, specifically at 95 Navy Street, in the heart of a neighborhood teeming with recent arrivals from southern Italy. The Capone family had fled poverty in Naples, seeking opportunity in America, but what they found was a different kind of struggle, one that young Alphonse would eventually master through violence and cunning. The neighborhood was a melting pot of Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants, all competing for the same scarce resources and opportunities. This multicultural environment taught Capone an invaluable lesson that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Success required working across ethnic lines, forming alliances with Irish gangsters, Jewish bootleggers, and Italian traditionalists alike. The Brooklyn streets of the early 1900s served as Capone's real education. He dropped out of school at 14 after striking a teacher who had hit him first, a moment that revealed both his hair-trigger temper and his refusal to accept disrespect from anyone. The incident occurred at PS 7 on Adams Street, and according to various accounts, the teacher, a woman named Miss O'Hare, had slapped young Alphonse for talking back in class. In an era when corporal punishment was routine, Capone's violent response, he reportedly knocked her down, was considered outrageous. It was in these formative years that Capone fell under the influence of Notorious, a calculated and sophisticated gangster who recognized potential in the broad-shouldered youth with the quick fists and quicker mind. Notorious operated several brothels and gambling dens in Brooklyn and became both mentor and father figure to Capone, teaching him that organized crime required more than muscle, it demanded business acumen, political connections, and strategic thinking. Notorious' philosophy was simple but revolutionary for its time. Why kill when you can negotiate? Why fight when you can buy politicians? This pragmatic approach contrasted sharply with the old-school mustache petes who believed in settling every dispute with blood. During his teenage years, Capone worked as a bartender and bouncer at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, run by gangster Frankie Yale, whose real name was Francesco Ioele. The Harvard Inn, located at 1000 824 Seaside Walk in Coney Island, was a notorious establishment that attracted sailors, gamblers, and Brooklyn's criminal element. It was here, during a dispute with a patron over a woman on a warm summer night in 1917, that Capone received the knife wounds across his left cheek that would earn him the nickname Scarface, a moniker he despised but could never escape. The patron, Frank Galluccio, had become enraged when Capone made an inappropriate comment to his sister, insulting her honor. Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed Capone 3 times across the face, leaving wounds that required 30 stitches and created the distinctive scars that would become infamous in newspaper photographs. The scars became his trademark, a permanent reminder that even the most powerful men carry the marks of their violent origins. Interestingly, Capone later hired Galluccio as a bodyguard, demonstrating the pragmatic forgiveness that characterized his approach to business. If a man had courage and skill, past grievances could be overlooked. When asked about his scars in later years, Capone would fabricate stories about war wounds received in France's Lost Battalion, preferring patriotic fiction to the humiliating truth of a barroom dispute over a woman. Yale and Notorious continued shaping Capone's criminal education, introducing him to the delicate balance between brutality and diplomacy that would later define his reign in Chicago. Yale taught him the art of the calculated hit, how to plan an execution so thoroughly that witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, and police found themselves with nothing but a corpse and a wall of silence. Yale himself was a master of this craft, allegedly responsible for dozens of murders that were never solved. Notorious, meanwhile, instructed Capone in the subtler arts of bribery, political manipulation, and money laundering. He showed him how to maintain detailed financial records using coded ledgers, how to structure operations through front companies, and how to identify which politicians could be bought and which were too honest to approach. One of Notorious' famous maxims was, "You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone," a philosophy that perfectly captured the blend of charm and menace that would characterize Capone's future empire. When Johnny Notorious moved to Chicago in 1909 to help his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, manage his vast network of brothels and gambling operations, he planted the seeds for what would become the Chicago outfit. Colosimo, born Vincenzo Colosimo in Calabria, Italy, had built himself into Chicago's most powerful vice lord, operating out of his famous restaurant, Colosimo's Café, at 2126 South Wabash Avenue. The establishment was a glittering palace of marble and mahogany where opera singers performed for audiences that included aldermen, judges, and the city's social elite alongside gangsters and their moles. Colosimo himself had become respectable in his own way, divorcing his first wife Victoria Moresco to marry Dale Winter, a beautiful young singer, in a ceremony that attracted Chicago's high society. By 1919, Notorious had summoned his protégé Capone to join him in the Windy City, sensing that Prohibition would create unprecedented opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Capone arrived in Chicago with his wife May and their infant son Albert Francis, Sonny Capone, ostensibly to work as Notorious' right-hand man in managing Colosimo's empire. The family first settled in a modest apartment on the South Side, and Capone took a public job as a furniture dealer to maintain a legitimate cover. What nobody could have predicted was how quickly the ambitious 20-year-old would transform from loyal lieutenant to absolute ruler. The problem was Big Jim Colosimo himself. The aging crime boss had grown comfortable with his established operations and refused to recognize the golden opportunity that Prohibition presented. While Notorious and Capone saw that Americans' insatiable thirst for alcohol could generate millions, Colosimo worried that bootlegging would draw too much heat from federal authorities. He was content with his vice-related revenues, his gambling profits, and his relatively stable arrangement with Chicago's corrupt political machine. Notorious arranged multiple meetings trying to convince his uncle to enter the bootlegging business, but Colosimo remained stubbornly resistant, allegedly telling Notorious, "We're in the business we know. Stick to what works." On the 11th of May, 1920, just months after Prohibition began, Colosimo was shot dead in the vestibule of his own cafe while waiting for a shipment of bootleg whiskey that Torrio had supposedly arranged, an ironic detail if true. Though never proven, most historians believe Torrio ordered the hit, possibly carried out by Frankie Yale, who conveniently happened to be visiting from New York that week. The murder weapon was never found. No witnesses came forward despite the cafe being full of people, and the case went unsolved. Colosimo's funeral became a spectacle of Chicago excess, with over 5,000 mourners, a funeral procession that stretched for blocks, and honorary pallbearers that included 3 judges, 8 aldermen, and an assistant state's attorney. Capone learned a crucial lesson that day. In the mafia, tradition and respect meant nothing when they conflicted with profit and progress. Even blood ties could be severed with a bullet when business demanded it. With Colosimo gone, Torrio and Capone built an empire that would make them both legendary. They established their headquarters in Cicero, a working-class suburb just west of Chicago that they essentially took over through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and ballot box stuffing. During the 1924 Cicero municipal elections, Capone's men patrolled polling places with baseball bats and guns, kidnapping opposition workers and threatening voters. When Capone's brother Frank was killed by Chicago police during the election day violence, Al attended the funeral consumed with rage, but emerged with a deeper understanding of the costs of power. They understood what made La Cosa Nostra our thing, as the Italian-American mafia called itself so effective at maintaining power across generations. The organization operated on a strict hierarchical structure modeled after military and corporate systems, with clear chains of command and specialized roles. At the top sat the boss, or Don, who made all major decisions and settled disputes. Below him, the underboss handled day-to-day operations, while the consigliere served as advisor and mediator. Captains, or capos, controlled crews of soldiers who carried out the actual work, collecting debts, running rackets, and eliminating problems. In Capone's organization, trusted men like Jack Machine Gun McGurn, Frank Nitti, and Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik occupied these crucial positions, each bringing specialized skills to the operation. But what truly bound the mafia together was omerta, the sacred code of silence that forbade cooperation with authorities under penalty of death. This wasn't merely a rule, it was the bedrock upon which the entire organization stood. Breaking omerta meant not just your own death, but potentially harm to your family. The code had roots stretching back to Sicily, where peasants learned not to cooperate with oppressive authorities, whether they were Spanish conquistadors, French occupiers, or Italian police. In America, this tradition evolved into an absolute prohibition against ratting that made prosecuting mobsters nearly impossible. The mafia also operated on principles of respect, loyalty, and the understanding that betrayal or disrespect demanded swift, often lethal punishment. These weren't abstract concepts, they were enforced through brutality that served as constant reminder to anyone considering disloyalty. When a small-time operator named Joe Howard made the fatal mistake of slapping Jake Guzik and calling him a dirty Jew in 1924, Capone personally shot him 6 times in a crowded saloon, demonstrating that disrespect to any member of his organization was disrespect to Capone himself. Witnesses claimed they saw nothing, and Capone was never charged. Capone absorbed these lessons and added his own innovations. He recognized that Prohibition had created a business opportunity unlike anything the underworld had ever seen. Middle-class Americans, previously law-abiding citizens, were suddenly willing customers for illegal alcohol. Capone didn't just sell bootleg liquor, he created a sophisticated distribution network that rivaled legitimate corporations. He controlled breweries like the Manhattan Brewing Company and the Seaborn Brewery on the North Side, distilleries in Wisconsin and Indiana, speakeasies throughout Chicago and its suburbs, and the transportation routes between them. He employed chemists to improve the quality of his products, accountants to manage the complex finances, and lawyers to exploit every loophole in the law. His operations extended to Canada, where he purchased high-quality whiskey from distilleries in Windsor and Montreal, smuggling it across the Great Lakes in specially modified speedboats. By 1925, when Torrio retired to Italy after surviving an assassination attempt that left him with bullets in his jaw, chest, and abdomen, an attack by the North Side Gang that nearly killed him outside his apartment at 7011 South Clyde Avenue. Capone had taken full control of the Chicago outfit, commanding an organization that generated an estimated $100 million annually, equivalent to $100 million annually, equivalent to roughly $100 million annually, equivalent to $1.5 billion today. Capone moved into the Lexington Hotel at 2135 South Michigan Avenue, taking over the 4th floor and turning it into a fortress with bulletproof steel doors, hidden escape routes, and an entourage of bodyguards who screened every visitor. Gambling operations complemented the bootlegging empire perfectly. Capone owned and operated numerous illegal casinos, from backroom poker games in dingy Southside taverns to elaborate gambling halls like the Ship in Burnham and the Hawthorne Smoke Shop in Cicero, where Chicago's elite risked fortunes on roulette wheels and card tables. The Hawthorne Inn, Capone's Cicero headquarters at 4833 22nd Street, featured a gambling operation that supposedly never closed, with high-stakes games running 24 hours a day. Capone himself was an avid gambler, sometimes losing tens of thousands of dollars in a single night of cards, but he understood that the house always won in the long run. He also controlled the city's extensive vice networks, managing hundreds of brothels that catered to every economic class, from dollar-a-trick houses in the Levee District to elegant resorts where wealthy businessmen entertained mistresses in luxury. The Four Deuces at 2222 South Wabash Avenue served as one of Capone's early bases, combining a saloon on the 1st floor, a gambling den on the 2nd, and brothel rooms on the 3rd and 4th floors, a vertical integration of vice that maximized profits from every square foot. These weren't chaotic, violent operations. Capone ran them with corporate efficiency, keeping detailed financial records, paying protection money to police and politicians, and ensuring that his establishments offered reliable service. He understood that repeat customers were more valuable than quick scores. He regularly paid off the Chicago police, with estimates suggesting that his bribery budget exceeded $30 million per year, distributed among beat cops, detectives, prosecutors, judges, and politicians at every level of government. Maintaining control over this vast criminal empire required more than business savvy. It demanded absolute loyalty from hundreds of subordinates, and Capone ensured that loyalty through a carefully calibrated system of rewards and punishments. Those who proved faithful enjoyed wealth beyond their dreams. Capone paid his top men handsomely, buying their houses, financing their lifestyles, and treating them like family. He purchased a palatial estate in Miami Beach at 93 Palm Avenue for $40,000 in 1928, a sprawling property with a swimming pool, gatehouse, and dock where he entertained his most trusted associates. At Christmas, he distributed lavish bonuses and gifts, sometimes handing out envelopes stuffed with $100 bills. He paid for the funerals of fallen associates with extravagant displays that cost thousands of dollars, sending massive floral arrangements and ensuring their families received financial support. But betrayal, incompetence, or even perceived disrespect met with consequences that ranged from brutal beatings to execution. Capone made examples of traitors, ensuring their fates became whispered warnings throughout the organization. Bodies appeared in ditches, dumped from cars with multiple gunshot wounds, or sometimes displayed publicly to send unmistakable messages. When 3 Sicilian hitmen allegedly sent by New York mob boss Joe Aiello arrived in Chicago to kill Capone in 1929, they were treated to a lavish banquet in their honor, plied with food and wine, and then beaten to death with baseball bats and Indian clubs in what became known as one of Capone's most notorious acts of personal violence. The punishments weren't arbitrary cruelty. They were calculated tools of organizational management. When a lieutenant skimmed profits, his beating served to remind every other collector that Capone tracked every dollar. When a rival gang member challenged outfit territory, his death established boundaries that others learned not to cross. The murder of Jaime Weiss, leader of the North Side Gang, in October 1926, outside Holy Name Cathedral, sent a clear message about the consequences of refusing Capone's peace offers. Weiss had been machine-gunned along with his bodyguard after rejecting multiple attempts at negotiation, his blood staining the cathedral steps in a grim tableau that shocked even hardened Chicagoans. Capone understood that in the absence of legal contracts and courts, violence became the only reliable enforcement mechanism. His reputation for ruthlessness actually reduced the need for constant violence. Most people complied simply because they knew the alternative. As Capone himself once observed with chilling frankness, "You can get more with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone," a variation of Notorious' earlier wisdom that reflected his evolution from student to master of the criminal art. The morning of the 14th of February 1929 dawned bitterly cold in Chicago, with temperatures hovering near zero and a thin layer of ice coating the streets. Inside a red brick garage at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men affiliated with George Bugs, Moran's North Side gang, gathered for what they believed would be a routine whiskey delivery. Among them were the Gusenberg brothers, Frank and Peter, seasoned enforcers who had survived numerous gang wars and had reputations as 2 of the toughest gunmen in Chicago's underworld. Albert Weinshank, who managed several cleaning and dyeing operations that served as fronts for illegal activities and bore a striking resemblance to Bugs Moran himself, a similarity that may have contributed to the timing of the attack. Adam Heyer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager who kept meticulous records of the organization's bootlegging operations. Albert Kachelik, known as James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law and a trusted lieutenant. John May, a mechanic who happened to be there working on a truck and was the only victim with no real criminal connections. And Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist with an office at 150 North State Street, who cultivated gangster associations as a thrilling hobby, often hanging around speakeasies and bragging about his connections to impress women. None of them realized they were living the final moments of their lives. What happened next would become the most infamous mass murder in American criminal history, a calculated act of violence so shocking that it would simultaneously cement Al Capone's reputation as America's most dangerous gangster and begin the process that would eventually lead to his downfall. The garage itself, the S.M.C. Cartage Company, was a front for Moran's bootlegging operations, located in the heart of North Side gang territory in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, and it had been under surveillance by Capone's men for weeks. At approximately 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac resembling a detective's car pulled up to the garage. 5 men emerged, 2 dressed in Chicago police uniforms complete with badges and regulation caps, 3 in civilian clothes wearing long overcoats that concealed their weapons. The sight of police uniforms was not unusual. Raids were routine, and Moran's men had been through countless shakedowns and mock arrests that ended with payoffs to corrupt officers. They obediently lined up against the garage's north wall, hands raised, expecting the standard procedure of arrest, bribery, and release that characterized Chicago's corrupt law enforcement. The wall itself would become infamous, with the bullet holes remaining visible for decades until the building was finally demolished in 1967, with individual bricks from the massacre wall eventually being sold as macabre souvenirs to collectors. Instead, the uniformed men signaled to their companions, who produced Thompson submachine guns, Tommy guns, or Chicago typewriters, as they were known on the streets, and opened fire. The garage erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire as over 70 bullets tore into the 7 men at point-blank range. The Thompson submachine guns, invented by General John T. Thompson for military use in World War I, had become the weapon of choice for gangsters because of their devastating firepower, capable of firing 600 to 1,500 rounds per minute. The shooters methodically swept their weapons back and forth, ensuring that each victim received multiple wounds. When the guns finally fell silent, the killers calmly walked out, with the men in civilian clothes appearing to be under arrest by the uniformed officers, their hands raised as if they were prisoners, a theatrical touch that allowed them to leave without arousing suspicion from neighbors who had heard the gunfire. This clever bit of staging meant that witnesses saw what appeared to be police successfully apprehending criminals, rather than the truth, a mass execution carried out with military precision. The only survivor, Frank Gusenberg, was found by actual police officers who arrived after neighbors reported the shooting. Despite having 14 bullet wounds in his body, in his chest, abdomen, arms, and legs, and lying in a pool of his own blood, Gusenberg refused to break omertà even as he lay dying. When Sergeant Thomas J. Loftus of the Chicago Police Department asked who had shot him, Gusenberg managed to gasp, "Nobody shot me," before losing consciousness. He died 3 hours later at Alexian Brothers Hospital without identifying his killers, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to the grave. His brother Peter had died instantly at the scene, shot multiple times in the head and body. The crime scene that greeted investigators was nightmarish pools of blood spread across the concrete floor. Bullet holes pockmarked the brick wall in a pattern that investigators later determined showed the shooters had fired in deliberate sweeping motions, and the victims' bodies lay in grotesque positions, their winter coats soaked with blood and their faces unrecognizable from the damage inflicted at close range. One victim, John May, was identified only by his German shepherd, Highball, who had been tied to the truck and was howling mournfully beside his master's corpse. The dog's loyalty and grief humanized the carnage in a way that resonated with the public, transforming what might have been just another gang killing into a national sensation. Newspapers ran photographs of the loyal dog, and the image became symbolic of the innocent casualties in Chicago's gang wars. Highball was later adopted by May's landlady, and his photograph appeared in newspapers across the country, becoming one of the most memorable images associated with the massacre. Although Al Capone was vacationing at his Palm Island estate in Miami Beach at the time of the massacre, establishing a convenient alibi by meeting with the Dade County District Attorney that very morning at his luxurious home at 93 Palm Avenue, where he discussed his recent arrest for carrying a concealed weapon, few doubted who had orchestrated the slaughter. The massacre was the culmination of years of warfare between Capone's Chicago outfit and Bugs Moran's North Side gang, a conflict that had claimed dozens of lives and turned Chicago's streets into a battlefield. The animosity had roots in multiple sources: territorial disputes over lucrative bootlegging routes, Moran's alliance with the late Dion O'Banion, and personal hatred that had intensified with each retaliatory killing. Moran himself had narrowly escaped death. Arriving at the garage late that morning, some accounts say he saw the police car outside and decided to grab coffee at a nearby diner. Others claim he was simply running behind schedule. When told about the massacre by reporters who rushed to his apartment at 1254 West Madison Street, Moran reportedly stated with bitter certainty, "Only Capone kills like that," a quote that appeared in newspapers across the country and crystallized public opinion about who was responsible. He elaborated in later interviews, saying, "The Capone mob did it. I've always known that Capone was after me, and I've tried to keep out of his way." Moran's organization never recovered from the massacre. Within months, he had lost control of his territory, and he would eventually die penniless in Leavenworth Prison in 1957, serving time for bank robbery. The Street Valentine's Day Massacre exemplified Capone's approach to violence, meticulously planned, overwhelmingly executed, and designed to send an unmistakable message. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage, but a carefully orchestrated military operation that required weeks of surveillance, precise timing, and ruthless efficiency. Capone had allegedly enlisted the services of his most trusted enforcer, Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn, born Vincenzo Antonio Gibaldi, to plan and execute the hit. McGurn, a former boxer and professional golfer turned killer, had personal reasons to hate the North Side gang. They had murdered his stepfather, Angelo DeMori, in a barbershop in 1923, and McGurn had sworn revenge. He approached the task with professional dedication, studying Moran's routines, identifying the garage as a vulnerable meeting point, and selecting the execution team with care. McGurn recruited talent from outside Chicago, including Fred "Killer" Burke, a particularly brutal gunman from Street. Louis, who was suspected of being one of the shooters, along with several other imported triggermen whose faces wouldn't be recognized by Moran's men. Burke was a professional bank robber and killer who belonged to the American Boys Gang and had worked with the Purple Gang in Detroit. The use of police uniforms was a stroke of psychological genius. It exploited the victims' familiarity with corrupt police raids, lowering their guard at the crucial moment. The uniforms were authentic Chicago Police Department issue, either stolen or purchased from corrupt officers, complete with proper badges and insignia. The getaway car was later found abandoned and burned in a garage at 1723 North Wood Street, eliminating potential evidence, but leaving the Thompson submachine guns, inside weapons that were traced back to Fred Burke after he was arrested for killing a Michigan police officer, Charles Skelly, in St. Joseph, Michigan, in December 1929. When police raided Burke's house, they found an arsenal that included the 2 Thompson submachine guns used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, definitively linking him to the crime, though he was never tried for it. Burke died in prison in 1940, never having revealed the full details of the massacre. The massacre demonstrated Capone's understanding that violence, when properly deployed, served purposes beyond the immediate elimination of enemies. It was theater, a grand performance designed to terrorize rivals, discipline subordinates, and establish dominance. The sheer brutality of the attack, 7 men machine-gunned against a wall in what newspapers called an execution, created a psychological shockwave that rippled through Chicago's underworld and beyond. Smaller gang leaders understood that defying Capone could result not in a quick bullet to the head in a dark alley, but in spectacular, humiliating annihilation that would be photographed, discussed, and remembered for generations. The message was clear. Capone didn't just win. He obliterated his opposition so thoroughly that their deaths became cautionary tales whispered in speakeasies and gambling dens across the city. Even hardened criminals who had witnessed countless murders were shaken by the massacre's brutality. Danny Stanton, a West Side gang leader, reportedly abandoned his criminal activities and moved to California after seeing the massacre photographs in the newspaper, telling associates he wanted no part of a city where such things could happen. Yet physical violence represented only one dimension of Capone's control mechanisms. He was equally adept at psychological manipulation, using fear, intimidation, and the mere threat of violence to achieve his objectives without firing a shot. Capone cultivated a public persona of jovial generosity, buying rounds for everyone in bars, distributing turkeys to poor families at Thanksgiving, opening soup kitchens during the Depression that fed thousands of unemployed workers at 935 South State Street, while simultaneously ensuring that everyone knew what happened to those who crossed him. During the brutal winter of 1930 to 1931, Capone's soup kitchen served 3 meals a day to anyone who needed them, with no questions asked and no attempts to proselytize. Newspapers estimated that the kitchen served over 120,000 meals at Capone's expense, creating a Robin Hood image that was carefully cultivated. This duality created a cognitive dissonance that was itself a form of control. People wanted to believe in Snorky Capone, the generous patron who looked after his neighborhood, because acknowledging the alternative that they lived under the rule of a psychopathic killer was too terrifying to contemplate. He attended charity events, donated to orphanages, and even attended operas and boxing matches where he was treated like a celebrity, signing autographs and posing for photographs with admirers. Capone's headquarters at the Lexington Hotel became a physical manifestation of this psychological intimidation. Visitors had to pass through multiple layers of security, each checkpoint reinforcing their vulnerability and Capone's power. The hotel, a massive structure at 2,135 South Michigan Avenue with over 400 rooms, had been transformed into a fortress. Bodyguards with bulging shoulder holsters scrutinized every arrival in the lobby, checking names against lists and patting down visitors for weapons. Armored doors reinforced with steel plating protected Capone's 4th-floor suite, and bulletproof glass had been installed in windows overlooking the street. Secret passages and escape routes had been built into the walls, allowing Capone to disappear if the building was raided. The entire 4th floor had been converted into his personal domain, with offices, conference rooms, a lavish personal suite, and accommodations for his bodyguards. Capone himself often kept people waiting for hours in the lobby, a deliberate tactic to create anxiety and establish dominance before the meeting even began. Visitors sat on uncomfortable furniture, watching armed men patrol the hallways, their anxiety mounting as minutes turned to hours. When he finally granted an audience, summoned by a bodyguard who would escort the visitor upstairs, he might be charming and avuncular, offering drinks from his well-stocked bar, expensive cigars from Cuba, and warm handshakes, or cold and menacing, letting long silences hang in the air while his dead eyes assessed the supplicant. This unpredictability was itself a weapon. People never knew which Capone they would encounter, the jovial host or the cold-blooded killer, and that uncertainty kept them off balance and compliant. One reporter described meeting Capone at the Lexington. He had the eyes of a dead fish. They looked at you, but they didn't see you. They saw through you, calculating what you were worth to him. The psychological warfare extended to how Capone dealt with the press and public officials. He understood that newspapers could be allies or enemies, and he cultivated relationships with certain reporters while terrorizing others. Journalists who wrote favorable stories found themselves invited to lavish parties at Capone's estate in Miami Beach, treated like honored guests, and provided with exclusive scoops that made their careers. Jake Lingle, a Chicago Tribune reporter, was on Capone's payroll for years, earning $65,000 annually, far more than his Tribune salary, in exchange for favorable coverage and advance warning of police raids. Those who published critical articles might find themselves threatened, beaten, or have their offices vandalized. The Chicago Tribune building at 435 North Michigan Avenue was machine-gunned on multiple occasions, with bullets shattering windows and terrorizing staff. On one occasion, in 1929, gunmen in a passing car fired over 30 bullets into the building's facade, sending employees diving for cover and leaving the limestone pockmarked with bullet holes. These attacks carried an implied message. Even powerful institutions weren't beyond Capone's reach. Yet Capone also displayed remarkable media savvy, granting interviews where he portrayed himself as a simple businessman, providing a service the public demanded. "I call myself a businessman," he told Liberty magazine reporter Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. in 1930. "I make my money by supplying a popular demand. If I break the law, my customers are as guilty as I am." This false equivalency between supplier and consumer, between organized crime and individual choice, was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that actually won him supporters among segments of the public. In another famous quote, Capone told reporters, "All I do is satisfy a public demand." Somebody had to throw some liquor on that thirst. Why not me? His publicity-savvy approach made him a celebrity. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine in March 1930, and his movements were reported in newspapers like those of a movie star or politician. Politicians and law enforcement officials faced similar psychological pressures. Capone maintained extensive lists of officials on his payroll, from beat cops earning $1.5 a week in bribes to judges receiving thousands of dollars monthly. Police Captain John Stege estimated that Capone spent over $1.5 a week in bribes to judges receiving thousands of dollars monthly. Police Captain John Stege estimated that Capone spent over $15 a week in bribes to judges receiving thousands of dollars monthly. Police Captain John Stege estimated that Capone spent over $30 million annually on political protection, a staggering sum that bought him immunity from prosecution and advance warning of any enforcement action. The corruption wasn't just about money, it was about complicity. Once an official accepted the first bribe, Capone owned them, holding the threat of exposure over their heads like a sword. Those who refused bribes found themselves under different pressures: anonymous threats against their families scrawled on notes left at their homes, manufactured scandals appearing in cooperative newspapers, or mysterious accidents that served as warnings. William McSwiggan, an aggressive assistant state's attorney who had prosecuted several Capone associates and earned the nickname the Hanging Prosecutor for his courtroom effectiveness, was machine-gunned to death on the 27th of April 1926 while drinking with some gangsters at the Pony Inn in Cicero. McSwiggan was hit by several bullets while standing outside the saloon at 5000 613 West Roosevelt Road, and 2 gangsters with him, Jim Doherty and Tom Duffy, were also killed in the barrage. Whether he was targeted deliberately for his prosecutions or killed by accident because he was associating with men marked for death remains disputed, but his death sent a chilling message to prosecutors. Even aggressive law enforcement could be fatal. Capone was questioned about the killing but never charged, and he later claimed that McSwiggan's death was unintentional, that the prosecutor was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Within his own organization, Capone's psychological control was perhaps most sophisticated. He created a culture of paranoia where loyalty was rewarded lavishly but suspicion could be fatal. Capone employed spies within his own ranks, men whose job was to report on other members' loyalty and activities, creating a network of informants that extended throughout his organization. This created an atmosphere where no one could be entirely trusted, where casual conversations in speakeasies might be reported to Capone's inner circle, and where expressing doubts about Capone's leadership could result in immediate retribution. The genius of this system was that it made members police themselves and each other, reducing the need for constant surveillance from the top. Men became careful about what they said, whom they trusted, and how they conducted themselves, knowing that a single reported indiscretion might lead to a late-night summons to the Lexington Hotel from which they might not return. Frank, the enforcer, Nitti, who managed much of this internal security apparatus, understood that fear kept the organization cohesive. He famously said, "A man who talks too much accomplishes little," a maxim that reinforced omerta while also serving as a veiled threat. The distinction between public and private punishments revealed Capone's strategic thinking about violence. Public executions like the street, Valentine's Day Massacre, or the murder of Jaime Weiss outside Holy Name Cathedral on the 11th of October 1926, served as advertisements of power, carefully staged events designed to generate publicity and spread fear. These theatrical killings made headlines, generated gossip, and entered criminal folklore as cautionary tales. When Weiss was killed, he was gunned down by machine gun fire from a second-floor window across the street from the cathedral at 738 North State Street, with over 10 bullets striking him and his bodyguard, Patrick Murray. The assassination occurred just steps from the cathedral entrance, and bullets even struck the cornerstone of the church itself, chipping off pieces of stone that remained visible for years. The symbolism wasn't lost on Chicagoans. Capone's reach extended even to the doorstep of Chicago's most prominent Catholic church. When Machine Gun Jack McGurn wanted to eliminate comedian Joe E. Lewis, who had violated his contract to perform at Capone-controlled nightclub The Green Mill at 4802 North Broadway by accepting a better offer at the competing New Rendezvous Café, the assault was deliberately brutal and public. On the 10th of November 1927, 3 men invaded Lewis's 10th-floor room at the Commonwealth Hotel at 2757 North Pine Grove Avenue, beat him savagely with pistol butts, slashed his face and throat with knives, and left him for dead in a pool of blood. Lewis survived but required extensive surgery that cost over $50,000. Capone himself reportedly contributed to the medical expenses, feeling the attack had gone too far and months of recovery. His vocal cords were severed, threatening to end his singing career, though he eventually recovered enough to perform comedy and rebuilt his career. The attack made national news, with newspapers running photographs of Lewis's bandaged face and detailed accounts of the brutality. The message to every performer, bartender, and employee in Capone's empire was unmistakable. Contractual obligations were not suggestions, and betrayal carried consequences that could destroy your life even if you survived. Private punishments served different purposes. These were internal disciplinary matters, dealt with quietly to avoid drawing unwanted attention or demoralizing the organization. When members skimmed money, betrayed confidences, or failed in their duties, they often simply disappeared. Bodies might be dumped in the Chicago River, which yielded dozens of corpses during the Prohibition era, many weighted down with concrete blocks or wrapped in barbed wire. Buried in the foundations of buildings under construction, a practice that led to macabre urban legends about bodies entombed in Chicago's infrastructure, or driven to remote locations in Indiana or Wisconsin where they would never be found. The Cal-Sag Channel, a waterway connecting the Calumet River to the Sanitary and Ship Canal, became notorious as a dumping ground for bodies, earning the nickname Death Canal. The uncertainty was itself terrifying. Men vanished, and their associates never learned their exact fate, only that they had somehow displeased Capone and paid the ultimate price. This ambiguity created more fear than public executions because it left imaginations to fill in the horrific details. Family members would search for missing men, filing reports with police who often showed little interest in investigating the disappearance of known criminals. The missing men became ghosts, their fates discussed in whispers but never confirmed, their absences serving as warnings to those who remained. The infamous incident involving the 3 Sicilian hitmen illustrated Capone's flair for combining public and private punishment in a display that became legendary. In May 1929, allegedly after learning through his intelligence network that New York mob boss Joe Aiello had sent assassins to kill him, Capone invited the 3 men identified in various accounts as Joseph Giunta, Albert Anselmi, and John Scalise, though some historians dispute whether these were the actual victims to a banquet at a roadhouse in Hammond, Indiana. They were treated as honored guests, seated at the head table in a private dining room, served multiple courses of Italian delicacies including pasta, veal, and fine wine, and toasted repeatedly as Capone praised their loyalty and service. After hours of celebration, when the men were relaxed and unsuspecting, their inhibitions lowered by alcohol and the apparent warmth of Capone's hospitality, Capone reportedly stood, made a speech about loyalty and betrayal that grew increasingly menacing in tone, and then personally beat them to death with a baseball bat or Indian club while his associates held them down and prevented their escape. The account, which comes from several sources including government investigators and mob informants, describes a scene of shocking brutality, Capone, in a frenzy of rage, repeatedly striking the men until their skulls were crushed and their faces unrecognizable. Their bodies were later discovered in a ditch along a rural road in Indiana, bound with wire and beaten beyond recognition, though they were eventually identified through fingerprints and dental records. The story, whether entirely true or embellished in the retelling some historians question certain details, became legendary within the underworld, a terrifying example of Capone's capacity for duplicitous violence. He could smile, share meals, embrace you like a brother, and then murder you without hesitation or remorse. The tale spread throughout Chicago's criminal community, repeated in hushed tones and embellished with each telling, until it became the ultimate cautionary tale about trusting Scarface. This capacity for sudden, explosive violence kept even Capone's closest associates in a constant state of alertness and anxiety. Frank Nitti, who would eventually succeed Capone as boss of the Chicago outfit after Capone's imprisonment, survived numerous purges and internal conflicts by maintaining absolute loyalty and never giving Capone reason to doubt him. Nitti, born Francesco Raffaele Nitto in Sicily, understood that survival in Capone's organization required demonstrating value while never appearing threatening to the boss's authority. Jake Guzik, the financial wizard who managed Capone's complex money laundering operations and earned the nickname Greasy Thumb for his habit of counting money, understood that his value lay in his irreplaceability. He made himself so essential to the organization's financial health that killing him would damage Capone's own interests. Guzik, a Polish Jew in a predominantly Italian organization, maintained his position through decades by being scrupulously honest with the money, never skimming, always accounting for every dollar, and by maintaining detailed records that only he fully understood. Yet even these trusted lieutenants knew that loyalty was a day-to-day proposition, that past service guaranteed nothing, and that Capone's favor could evaporate in an instant if he perceived betrayal or incompetence. They walked a tightrope, balancing the wealth and power their positions provided against the constant knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of disloyalty, or even a perceived slight could result in their execution. And so we fade out on the shadow of Al Capone's world, where loyalty was enforced with fear and silence was paid in blood. From the backrooms of Chicago in the 920 seconds to punishments whispered about but never written down. Capone ruled not just with money but with consequences. As the legend himself once said, "You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than with a kind word alone." History remembers the glamour, but it was the punishments that kept the empire standing. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.